All right, this week we have Paul Vout again. Paul just got back from a fantastic SatCom cyber exercise, and this is probably our first operational technology OT cyber exercise that we saw this much effort holistically put into, and it's a refreshing to us, right? Very refreshing to us. And we wanted to talk through why, what we've never seen this much effort put into any OT before. What was it that we genuinely came to a conclusion was important in this exercise, and how we can maybe cross-reference that to other OT things and what the future will be in SatCom. I think those will be some big topics today. But Paul, first of all, welcome and tell me the background. Tell me about this experience. Give some background how it went.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for having me again. I'm really excited to talk about this topic near and dear to my heart on a couple of different iterations, but yes. So myself and some Elastic colleagues represented Elastic out at an exercise last week that was specifically for SATCOM-based cyber threats and techniques an attacker might use to compromise a given satellite. You might also hear me refer to them as spacecraft because that's how they refer to it, but typically it's just a satellite. The unique part in this case, and this is all public information, so there's a satellite called Moonlighter. And it's a satellite, it's a real satellite. It's in orbit right now, and it's very small. It's what they call a microsat or even a nanosat. Pretty small, kind of think of like basically a Dell server size piece of equipment up in space that has some solar panels attached to it for energy generation. And during the exercise, the intent was to have, as usual in these cyber exercises, there's a blue team, which is the defense. There's a red team, which is the offense. And then there's a white cell that's kind of in the middle. And they play kind of like the coordinators and the referees of the exercise. And the idea is that there are different categories of attacks that your average defender might see. Some of them are what we all think about in cyber. Like, you might have someone trying to compromise a password or scan a list of IPs or ports or, find services or attempt some brute force things. But there's also some very specific satellite and control type of attacks that occur, including directional things that we can talk about. So the direction of where your satellites are pointing at any given point in time is extremely, extremely important. Not only is it in a three-dimensional space, but it is in a space pretty far away from the Earth. And so if you're pointing at the Earth, every second of degree, right, means, hundreds of miles, basically. So in order to be very precise, you need very precise coordination of your cameras with your position. So we talked about some of those things. Extremely interesting. This is my second time out there. Frankly, it was, the first time was very exciting, but the second time was even better because I kind of knew what to expect. And I kind of knew some of the things that Red was going to try. So very interesting exercise.
Yeah, tell me it's the OT thing. So again, like what is OT, IT, IT and OT, especially in the cyber world. So IT is the computers. We know computers very well, but as everybody knows, computers by themselves basically do nothing. You need a system to work something to do that. And so like the satellite is that system. It's out in orbit, it's doing something interesting. It could be a machine, it could be a car, it could be something that's doing something, right? And the ability to do a cyber exercise for OT, I think, is extremely interesting in this circumstance. How do you see it? So you talked about some of those things that you were focusing on, which are not like your classic IT cyber exercise, which would be like, to your point, like passwords and such. How did it make the exercise different? What when you were looking at those things? What was different in that sense?
Yeah, great question. So specifically with OT, operational technology and control systems and SCADA, there's ICS, there's a bunch of different terms for it. Basically, like you're pointing out, Nathan, it's a way to use a computer to control something that's actually doing something. So in the satellite case, really the two attacks that Red wanted to prosecute the most was the directional control of the satellite and then the energy consumption of that satellite. And I'll talk about each briefly. So directional, kind of obvious that that's a thing, right? You would want your satellite to be in control, right? So you don't want it just spinning mindlessly around the planet. But at the same time, in order to orient that satellite, the cameras on the satellite have to be pointed in a very specific direction. Because there's something called star field navigation that they use, where one of the cameras is pointed literally at a field of stars, and it helps to orient itself in space to a particular direction, very precisely, I might add, extremely precisely. For two reasons. You need the camera to know where you're at, but then also, let's say that you have, one of your missions of that satellite, let's just say, is to take photographs of somewhere on the planet. Then you need those cameras to be pointed very precisely. And that's kind of the operational control of your movement and your axes of movement. Do you have, when you fire your rockets, if you have any, and these did not, but if you were to actually move it around a little bit, how would you do that? What is the way to do that? Can you compromise that signal from the ground station to the satellite? Can you compromise the way that the satellite interprets those signals? There's different ways to do it, right? There's different ways to do it at the source, at the destination. Again, kind of a little bit of your overlap on cyber stuff. The other part of the operational technology is powering all of these devices on the satellite. And that includes, all your computer systems, your cameras, any life support for that satellite that it requires. That all requires battery power, power from some source. And so therefore you have to manipulate your solar panels, right? So again, basically think of a Dell server with some solar panels hanging off of it, and you pretty much got the exact size of the satellite that we're talking about. So if those solar panels are pointing at the sun or in some general vicinity, you're probably good, right? You're getting power. You may be using power. You are using power to do things on the satellite, but you're also regaining that battery juice, right, from your solar panels. Well, what if an attacker said, "Hey, you know what? There's kind of I kind of call it the gross way to attack something. You could say extremely malicious. You just say, oh, I just want to knock the solar panels offline completely, right? Just take them out. So we just want to have the satellite eventually die. It would run on battery power for a while, probably several days, but eventually it's going to die. That's one way to do it. But if you're a more sophisticated attacker, and there's many out there, you would do something more subtle. You would instead maybe point one of the solar panels slightly off so that it's not regenerating as much energy as forecast or as it could do. In the same vein, if you were able to manipulate some of the telemetry that was coming from those batteries or those solar panels and say, hey, for instance, you might tell the end user, yes, I'm operating at 100% capacity, Mr. End User, when in reality, the attacker is making you think that you're at 100% when you're really at 10% or 20%. So you might continue to try and do your mission, not knowing you're literally about to run out of power. So maybe halfway through your mission, again, maybe your mission is taking photographs of something. All right, so taking, for argument's sake, 1,000 photographs within, say, a minute, you're only taking 100 photographs. What does that mean? So for your analyst who has to digest that imagery information, you get maybe, we're all kind of familiar with the pixelated look. You have a very high def picture, but when you really zoom in, it starts to pixelate. So similar, instead of having a very high quality picture to give your analysts downstream, you now have a degraded, I'll just call it degraded. Maybe you don't even have a picture at all. Maybe the computer of the camera that's generating couldn't recover from not having enough power to do it. So those two things, in summary, your directional control of a satellite, extremely important, and the way that you both use and regenerate power on a satellite, extremely important, and therefore important attack vectors to look at and defend against.
Thank you. That's, I mean, there's so many elements that are so different. It's just so different, right? If there was in the MITRE attack matrix, I'm going to bring that up. If there was a SatCom MITRE attack matrix, what do you think would look different? What would the attacks, how many of the attacks are currently in the IT cyber MITRE attack matrix? How many new ones would exist, would you say?
Interesting. So I'd say that some already exist, but they're probably labeled as normal IT stuff, but they would equally apply to satellite, as we talked about. There are some things that are ubiquitous. So on this particular satellite, it's powered by Linux, right? So it's a Linux operating system under the hood. I'm not saying all of the normal vulnerabilities apply because it is a very specific kernel, a very specific Linux kernel, hardened, quote unquote, right? You know, there's no extraneous services running. Nobody's surfing the web on this computer, right? So there's a lot of things that are turned off completely. But yes, some of those things still exist. In terms of the number of satellite things, as mentioned, directional control would be huge, energy consumption, all of the things that might exist on a satellite. Yeah, I'll pick a round number. I'll say at least a dozen of the high level tactics, or I should say I'll call them tactics techniques because some of them are obviously very satellite specific. Compromising your telemetry might be analogous to something on the regular IT world, right? It's still RF basically going up and down from your ground station to your satellite. But at some point, your attacker has done like the man in the middle type of attack, where you're basically sending your ground signals through a proxy that's run by the attacker, and then the attacker gets to choose which things go to the satellite and which don't. So kind of those two answers, Nathan.
Yeah, and let's take you that let's take that a step further then. So best practices. This was the second exercise you were part of. I'm sure there are many others throughout that. What best practices are they going to be different? Are when we get a solid SatCom best practice list, what would those differences be between the IT classic, we're trying to keep people out of our app, to this where there's the RF signal. We are still trying to keep people out of that app, but there's some specific use cases. Is it going to be a defined version of what the IT is, where IT is kind of we were securing 4,000 apps. This one's one single app, so we're focusing on this single app. Or is it going to be something different when we get to that best practice level?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of both, because you're going to have to do more homework in terms of your suppliers, what parts, what system you on that satellite, right? Your typical
That's how
computer,
people are going to gain access.
exactly.
The parts. Interesting. Okay.
That's exactly right. You know, your typical computer, server, laptop, pretty easy to figure out, right? You got RAM and a CPU and an operating system and storage and a screen, right, and a keyboard. Pretty straightforward. Satellites, obviously, there's more stuff on them, and the suppliers of those parts become extremely more important, both from physical considerations like temperature, vibration, right? Because you got to shoot the satellite up, right? So there's a vibration factor, there's a temperature factor, you know, you have a vacuum of space, right? And temperature extremes. Depending if your satellite is synchronous or asynchronous around a planet, you know, you might be, you know, very hot for a while, and then you might be extremely cold for a while, kind of like the moon, right? You know, vast differences of temperatures. So, in terms of the differences, typically, you know, yeah, I guess if you're an attacker, you could probably overclock the CPU and make it go hot, but that's not really a thing. There's a lot more interesting ways. And what are you going to do? You're going to basically take down the computer, and not that big a deal, and frankly, not that hard to do. Not going to give you a lot of value unless you're just like a what I call a
Redundancy, and yeah, we're satellites. I mean, it's so much more expensive to have redundancy in a SatCom. It's
more expensive, more susceptible to environmental considerations that an attacker can exploit or not. Again, your sophisticated attackers are going to be much more subtle in what they try and do. Do happen to get control of your spacecraft or of your satellite. Now, the chances of them just destroying it, I don't know, it's possible, but more likely they're going to want to A, understand what you're doing with the satellite, number one, then B, if they can reuse that for something else, that might be a vector as well, right? Then just saying, okay, and I don't know if you've seen the videos. I have no idea if it's true or not, but there's some things on YouTube where there's satellites that can capture other satellites. right? So you deploy a satellite to go and capture something else, and then, whatever you do with it from there. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's mine.
Yeah, it kind of connects. The whole reason I asked that question was to figure out some of the things you said earlier, and it's making more sense in that a lot of that MITRE tech framework will exist, but some things are going to be focused on that we've never focused as heavily on because it has not been an issue. Like taking down a single server has never been a massive value to IT. But in the SAT world, oh yeah, huge value right there.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And the RF communication, supply chain. We've always talked about supply chain. That's always been a discussion. It's not the highest priority, and for good reason. Whereas with the SatCom, I see how it could be top tier priority because we can't secure everything, right? We got to pick and choose what's top tier. But in the SatCom, it would make perfect sense that it should be a top tier security cyber there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's multiple solutions, including the Elastic solution for monitoring those things. Supply chain, critical in, let's just say, military manufacturing in general, but especially when, you've lost complete control of that device once you shoot it up in the air. It's not like an airplane, right? Where you take off, you fly around, you come back, you can do stuff on the aircraft to see what happened. No, once you shoot this sucker up, it's up there, and it's going to be up there until it either, retrogrades or just lives as space junk, of which there's thousands of objects up there already. So yeah, tracking.
Spinning this up a little bit. So again, back to OT. This is kind of a new cyber experience for us. Maybe people are watching this and like, oh, I've been to many OT things. Before this discussion, you and I were talking through some of the other very important OT things that we have heard about. Hey, we need to secure this. And we've been hearing about that forever. Why do you think this is the first one you went after? And I think we kind of answered this earlier, but I'll let you kind of walk through that. Let's start there. Why do you think we're looking at SatCom as opposed to the one that everyone talks about is HVAC, SCADA, ICS type stuff? So yeah.
Yeah, for me, and you're absolutely right. HVAC, frankly, critical from many places, and you're right, is one of the first things people think about of monitoring OT. For me, this came up last year, and it was at the request of a customer that we wanted to go and support. We were supporting them on other things, and they just happened to be participating in this exercise. And because Elastic, our Elastic team had done other OT monitoring, different Air Force elements. I don't know if it was a direct referral or if we just kind of got asked the questions. Hey, Elastic, could you come and help us understand some of the data that we're receiving from the satellite? And then even better, help the Blue team understand that data and how it applies to something benign, right? Where it's just normal operational data that's coming across, or if it's, I'll say, suspicious first, maybe some telemetry crosses like a threshold, right? Maybe you're used to getting, for argument's sake, say 100 messages a minute, and all of a sudden you get one message a minute. Yeah, maybe that's a problem. Maybe the other way, maybe you're getting 1,000 messages a minute. Maybe there is some underlying problem. So when we kind of looked at that, we said, well, yeah, we do that stuff all the time. It's just a matter of taking in the source data, mapping it into Elasticsearch was a critical part, and then showing basically on our UI, on our user interface to the operators and analysts, hey, this is what normal looks like, right? So in our camera example earlier, our directional camera, you get certain status messages from that camera every 5 seconds, let's say. So every 5 seconds, the camera reports in and says, yep, I'm good, I'm ready to go, and here's where I'm pointing, right? Basically a timestamp with a set of coordinates and a status button. That's it. It's like literally 6 fields. So very small amount of data, but guess what? Super important data for us to have and for us to process. So all of this so just for me personally, super interesting. A lot of the things that the red team on our first iteration talked about, frankly, I'd never heard of. Like, I didn't know it was a thing to point your solar panels just a little bit off. Again, not to completely destroy them or not to lose power completely, but just to lose enough power to do one thing. So, and as you mentioned, it all kind of ties back into that secure supply chain thread for me, because a lot of the parameters that your supply chain components engineer to are based upon a requirements document, right? It's the government. Just like any other government entity, they have a requirements document, and all of the suppliers attempt to meet those specifications. As you do when you're chosen, and supply, part X. Maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's like the cooling system, something like that. Maybe it's the radio receivers, the antennas, whatever it happens to be. Those parts are critical to understand. Therefore, when Blue gets these status messages, the other part that was interesting to me was that I got to teach folks satellite hacking, and that's never really been my background, right? But since I went through it the first time, I'm like, oh yeah, now I kind of see what Red was doing. So on the second version, a couple of weeks ago, I'm like, I couldn't give things away, right? I couldn't give things away. I could give hints to the operators to go, hey, maybe if you pulled up this piece of data and put it on a dashboard or correlated it against this other piece of information, that might be helpful. So to me, one of the rewarding parts was working with with the Guardians, Space Force, right? Most of them were Guardians. There was definitely some Air Force folks there, but one particular airman. In fact, you and I had to take a phone call from that person. He won MVP of that exercise, thanks to his intense what's the word? Inquisitiveness about the product and about all of the data, not just Elastic, right? Because there was multiple owners in this environment.
Yeah, I think you would too. Like someone who's just, I'm all in. I'm gonna ask the questions. Like if I just keep asking questions and I'll get the right answers. So yeah.
Exactly.
So where does and you brought up an interesting point we haven't talked about. What's the value of Elastic to such an exercise, red blue team exercise?
Yeah, I
What
think,
did you
yeah.
see when you were on site? What were they appreciative of with Elastic?
Yep. So one of the things within Elastic is our ability to take in, since I've been here, which is quite a while now, almost any type of data into Elasticsearch and have it makes, right? Because there's multiple sources of raw data that might come in. And we've talked about almost all of them: telemetry, camera stuff, energy things. All of these are separate signals, basically, separate signals that are being sent through a telemetry pipe down to the ground station. And so, where Elastic plays a fantastic part is our ability to interpret all of those things through something we call an ingest pipeline. And all that means is that it's a way to basically map your source data, your source telemetry data, to Elastic World. And the classic example for me, and this is true in SatCom, this is true in almost any IT, OT thing out there, is they almost all have an IP address. So your source IP field might be called many different things, right? Microsoft might call it IP. If it happened to be a Cisco device for whatever reason, it might be IP underscore address and so on. So typically when you're doing analysis, you don't really care what your source field formats are in. You just want to look up 10.1, right? IP address 10.1. So Elastic sits in the middle and ingests that source data, maps into Elastic World. So when your analysts are pulling up dashboards and doing queries and running correlations, they can just type in IP address and it's ubiquitous across all of the source data. Huge time saver. So instead of having to memorize or look up all of the different vendor formats for IP address and the hundreds of other fields that are out there, Elastic makes that easy by doing that upfront. And by the way, you can still look at the raw data. So we actually have a field that we map, or as an option, you can map this field into the ingest pipeline to keep the raw data. So yes, you're getting the Elastic view, but if you want literally like that Linux log line, which frankly sometimes I like, we preserve that field within the index, within the Elastic index that we map, and make that available to the operators as well. So to summarize, Elastic makes it very easy to ingest multiple different sources of data and present it in a friendly, useful way to the analysts.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. I'm going to answer one of my earlier questions that I don't think you followed where I was trying to lead you. So I think this whole SatCom being able to get towards doing satellite type cyber stuff. I think the value is that we we're focusing on that in the United States at this point. I think that's a huge thing. Like we've made a major push to the Space Force, and it's helped us really consolidate our efforts, all efforts, not just cyber, but all efforts to protect our satellites. And that's I mean, kudos to us for doing that. What what you've been able to I'm this believer that sometimes when we have a big huge problem, all OT cyber right now, I think in the cyber world we could say we have this massive OT cyber concern. The right way to figure out how to deal with it is to narrow down and focus on one and at least see what we learned from that one to see how we can utilize what we learned in other areas, right? So if someone was going after another OT cyber, SCADA could be there's so many out there, right? Like aircraft, it could be so many things. What did you learn from this that they could utilize to improve the cyber of another thing that you're a little surprised maybe you didn't even think about until you were actually in there focusing on it? Like what would help some of those other areas of OT as well?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Senator. So part of it is process. I'll start with kind of the less sexy side and say part of it is process. So the big difference that I saw between the first exercise last year and the exercise a couple of weeks ago this year was the process that they followed to identify things. How the first iteration, was a little bit wild, wild west. So we weren't sure what type of data we were going to get. And they weren't, the Blue wasn't sure what type of data that they needed to make any real decisions upon, right, to solve any of the challenges that were presented to them. So it was kind of an ad hoc, kind of hunt and peck method. One thing that was drilled into Blue for this exercise, and thanks to my colleague Andrew for being there for this, was that Blue had a much more structured way of understanding what was. So, because it's very easy to get shiny object syndrome when you're on new tools. So, first iteration, Elastic was pretty new to some of the analysts there. This time we had gone through some training and there was a framework that I guess the organizers of the event had passed on to the master sergeant and the captain who were running the Blue team to say, hey, these are the types of things that we need to really focus on. And here's what I find in other organizations, OT, IT, NET, is that there's less of that. There's less of a real robust framework to go, hey, as an analyst, I come into my desk and I have an operational area that I'm responsible for. What do I look for? Well, do I just kind of go into an interface and just looking for stuff? Because, sometimes that is productive if you know what you're looking for. Or maybe I'm more junior, right? Maybe I'm, just a few years out of tech school or whatever. Let's take a military example. Maybe I need a little bit more structure as to what I'm looking for until I'm more comfortable. So for me, what I saw that was very useful in the SatCom world could equally be applied to almost any IT. And obviously some organizations do that, but many don't. And even if they do, there's a give in there, if you will. There's a framework, it's published, they have dashboards, maybe it's even an Elastic dashboard. But sometimes the process of hunting through things is not as structured as it could be, especially for your junior operators, the folks who aren't the super ninjas. And let's face it, most folks in cyber are not the super ninjas, and there's no need for them to be, frankly. But having the awareness of what super ninjas look for and condensing that into something that, corpus of knowledge that you can say, hey, Paul, hey, Nathan, when you come in tomorrow, we're going to be looking for A, B, C, and D. And here's how we're going to do it. Not, hey, Nathan and Paul, when you come in tomorrow, there's coffee and donuts, go find your normal alerts and report out. That structure, the previous example with the structure is super critical to keep people focused. And if it's done, in Paul's words, correctly, there's a huge training element that you get out of it. So nobody has unlimited money for training, but if your process helps your personnel start to train up, guess what? Then they become empowered to teach the next round of cyber operators that come into their unit, right? Because, There's always people cycling in and out, and everyone has different levels of skill. So probably not again, probably not the most exciting example, but that process structure is something I really took away with.
It's becoming a recurring theme on this podcast, and it's why Elastic became successful within the DoD as well, is consolidating efforts and building a process around it. I mean that's our story, is that the red and the blue teams were going, and this is years ago, years and years and years ago, right? Missouri Cyber got together and they said, you're great at network, you're great at looking at audit logs, you're great at, we're all going to give ourselves the same system. We're going to call it Rock NSM, and it's these tools all together, and we're going to build a process. You're the new guy. You've only been on our team for a couple weeks. We know that you're not going to be as awesome as this person over here who's been working on this for 10 years, right? We're all having the same system. These are your steps. These are your things you have to do. The new guy, right? Old person, if any actions come from the new person, then you look at them. But we're all looking at the same. But that process crushed the red team for the first time ever. And it really is the success story of Elastic, how Elastic started moving forward in the DoD. And it's simple, but it's hard. Like getting that process set up is, yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer there. Anything else before we move on?
No, I think we pretty much covered it, Nathan. Again, I really appreciate you having me today. Super interesting topic. For all those out there, check out the Moonlighter satellite. Just Google Moonlighter. It'll come right up. You can get some more information there. Obviously, we're elastic.co, so happy to take questions later on as well.
Cool. Paul, thanks, man. You have a great day.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate you.